Picture London in 1667. The Great Fire's ashes have barely cooled. The city is rebuilding. And at Whitehall Palace, England's most powerful man, King Charles II, is about to face something he's never encountered before: rejection. The woman who refused him was Teresa Stuart, 15 years old, breathtakingly beautiful, and utterly uninterested in becoming the king's mistress. What happened next would become one of the most unusual stories in British royal history. Charles II, a man accustomed to getting whatever he desired, would spend years pursuing Frances. She would continue refusing him, and in a twist that defied all logic of the era, her refusal wouldn't destroy her. It would make her one of the most celebrated women in England. The king who couldn't have her would ensure she lived in comfort and style for the rest of her life. The house that became her refuge, Ranger's House in Greenwich, still stands today. A perfect example of Georgian elegance. 40 rooms of refined architecture overlooking Greenwich Park. But this isn't just a story about a beautiful house. It's about power, desire, and the extraordinary price one king was willing to pay for a woman who simply said no. I think what makes this story so compelling is how it inverts everything we think we know about royal mistresses and power dynamics in Restoration England. This wasn't a tale of seduction and influence, it was a tale of resistance and, remarkably, respect. Teresa Stuart was born in 1647, though the exact date remains uncertain. She arrived in England in 1663, at the invitation of Queen Catherine of Braganza. The Queen, struggling to produce an heir, and watching her husband openly cavort with mistresses, thought the young Frances, barely 16, would make a pleasant companion. Someone innocent, someone safe. Catherine of Braganza had catastrophically misjudged the situation. Frances came from an aristocratic Scottish-French family. Her father, Walter Stewart, was a physician who had served Charles I. Her mother, Sophia Stuart, was connected to the French court. When Charles I was executed and the royal family fled into exile, the Stuarts went too. Frances grew up in France, at the exiled court of Queen Henrietta Maria, Charles II's mother. She learned French manners, French fashion, French dancing. When she finally came to England in 1663, she brought with her an air of continental sophistication that made every other woman at the English court seem provincial by comparison. The diarist Samuel Pepys saw her at court soon after her arrival. He wrote that she was the greatest beauty I ever saw in my life. Another observer noted she was the prettiest girl in the world. Even John Evelyn, not prone to excessive praise, called her a young lady of extraordinary beauty. But here's what made Frances truly dangerous to the established order of Charles II's court. She was beautiful in a completely new way. Charles's current mistress, Barbara Villiers, the Countess of Castlemaine, was a voluptuous, dark-haired, sexually aggressive woman who dominated the king through sheer force of personality and bedroom prowess. Frances was something entirely different. Slim, fair, delicate, with a sweetness of manner that seemed utterly genuine. She was also, crucially, a virgin. And she intended to stay that way until marriage. Charles II noticed her immediately. Within weeks of her arrival, he was openly pursuing her. And Frances, to the shock of everyone at court, was declining his advances. To understand how unprecedented Frances's refusal was, you need to understand Charles II. He was 33 years old in 1663, at the height of his power and charm. He had returned from exile just 3 years earlier to reclaim his throne. He was witty, cultured, good-looking in a dark, saturnine way, and possessed of an apparently insatiable sexual appetite. Charles didn't rape women. He didn't need to. He charmed them. He was genuinely good company, funny, intelligent, interested in science and art. Women fell into his bed because they wanted to be there. Because being the king's mistress meant wealth, titles, influence, apartments at Whitehall, allowances measured in thousands of pounds per year. Barbara Villiers had become Countess of Castlemaine through the king's favour. She lived in palatial apartments. Her children, widely acknowledged to be the king's bastards, were given noble titles. She wielded more political influence than most of the king's ministers. So when Frances Stuart arrived at court, everyone assumed she would follow the same path. The king wanted her. Therefore, she would become his mistress. It was simply how things worked. Except Frances didn't see it that way. She accepted the king's attentions up to a point. She let him sit with her at social gatherings. She played cards with him. She danced with him. She flirted with him in that careful, practiced way that kept him interested without promising anything. But she wouldn't sleep with him. Samuel Pepys recorded the gossip with fascination. In October 1663, he wrote that Frances is already so great a favourite that the Queen nor King's mistress is nothing to her. By December, he was noting that all the world knew the king was besotted with her, but that Frances remained as innocent as a babe. The court watched this drama unfold with a mixture of admiration and horror. Barbara Villiers, the reigning mistress, was furious. She recognized a threat when she saw one. Frances wasn't playing the game correctly. She wasn't trading sex for position. She was getting the position, the king's favour, apartments at Whitehall, jewels, dresses, without surrendering anything. It drove Charles to distraction. Charles tried everything. He gave Frances apartments near his own. He showered her with gifts. He wrote her letters. He made her a lady of the bedchamber to the Queen, which gave her a salary and official status at court. In 1665, he commissioned a medal to be struck featuring her profile. This was extraordinary. Royal medals typically featured members of the royal family or great military heroes. Frances Stuart was neither. She was simply a young woman the king wanted to sleep with. The medal designer John Roetiers captured Frances in profile with her hair piled high, dressed as the Roman goddess Britannia, holding a shield and trident. The image was so perfect, so iconic, that it became the model for Britannia on British coinage, a design that would last for centuries. Every time an Englishman handled a penny or a farthing, he was looking at the face of Frances Stuart, the woman who refused a king. I think there's something deeply ironic about that. Frances's face became the symbol of Britain itself, representing imperial power and national identity, all because Charles was so obsessed with her that he wanted to see her image on currency. But gifts and honours weren't enough. Frances wanted marriage, real marriage to someone appropriate that would secure her position without compromising her virtue. Charles couldn't marry her. He was already married to Catherine of Braganza. And even if he weren't, Frances's birth, while noble, wasn't nearly grand enough for a king. Royal marriages were political alliances between nations. Charles could make Frances a mistress. He could make her one of the richest, most powerful women in England. But he couldn't make her his queen. Frances understood this. She also understood that becoming Charles's mistress would make her unmarriageable to anyone else. Once a woman had been the king's lover, no nobleman would take her as a wife. She would be trapped in the role of royal mistress until Charles tired of her, and then she would be cast aside, her reputation ruined. So Frances continued to refuse, and Charles continued to pursue. The standoff lasted for years. The court divided into factions. Some admired Frances's virtue. Others thought she was a fool who would eventually be discarded for refusing the king. Barbara Villiers actively worked to undermine her, spreading rumours and trying to convince Charles to move on. In 1667, everything changed. On the night of March 30th, 1667, Frances Stuart disappeared from Whitehall Palace. She had eloped with Charles Stuart, 3rd Duke of Richmond and 6th Duke of Lennox. The Duke was a distant cousin of the king. They shared the Stuart name, though Richmond's family came from a different branch. He was 6 years older than Frances, wealthy, and crucially willing to marry her despite the king's obvious interest. They fled to Richmond's country estate and were married immediately. Charles II was absolutely furious. Samuel Pepys recorded that the king was mad with rage. Charles banished both Francis and the Duke of Richmond from court. He refused to receive them. For months, he wouldn't speak Richmond's name without cursing. But here's what's extraordinary. Even in his fury, Charles didn't destroy them. He could have. Charles II was an absolute monarch. He could have stripped Richmond of his titles. He could have confiscated his estates. He could have found some legal pretext to annul the marriage and imprison Richmond. He did none of these things. Instead, after several months of angry sulking, Charles began the slow process of forgiveness. By the end of 1667, he had allowed Frances and her husband back to court. By 1668, he was once again showering Frances with gifts and honors, though now, crucially, with her husband's full knowledge and consent. Richmond, for his part, seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. His wife was the king's favorite. That brought benefits. Charles gave Richmond lucrative positions and appointments. The Duke grew richer and more influential because his wife had the king's affection, but not his bed. I find this arrangement fascinating because it suggests something important about Charles's character. He genuinely cared for Frances, not just as an object of lust, but as a person. He wanted her to be happy. And if marriage to Richmond made her happy, he could accept that, even if it meant he would never have her sexually. In 1688, Frances's life changed dramatically. Charles Stewart, Duke of Richmond, died suddenly at the age of 38. The exact cause is unclear, possibly smallpox or pneumonia. Frances, at 41, was a widow. Charles II had died 3 years earlier, in 1685. His brother, James II, was now king. But James's tenure would be short. He would be overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Frances had survived 3 monarchs and was about to see a 4th and 5th, William III and Mary II. Despite the changing political landscape, Frances remained secure. Charles II had ensured her future. In his will, he left her a generous pension. More importantly, he had given her prestigious appointments that came with housing and income. One of these appointments was Ranger of Greenwich Park. The position of Ranger was ancient and prestigious. The Ranger was responsible for overseeing Greenwich Park, one of London's royal parks. The role came with a salary, authority over the park's maintenance and game, and, crucially, a house. That house was Ranger's house. Now here's where the architectural history gets complicated, because the house Frances moved into in the 1690s was not the house that stands today. The current Ranger's house was built later, in the 1720s, but it was built on the site of the earlier Ranger's Lodge, and it inherited the position's prestige and function. Frances lived in the earlier building, a substantial residence on the western edge of Greenwich Park, overlooking the Heath. It gave her independence, space, and a position of respect. She was no longer just the beauty who refused the king. She was the Ranger of Greenwich Park, a royal official with responsibilities and authority. She held the position until her death in 1702 at the age of 55. By then, she had outlived Charles II by 17 years. She had remained unmarried after Richmond's death, living comfortably on her pensions and income from her appointments. She had won. She had maintained her virtue, married respectably, lived well, and died honored. Charles II had pursued her for years, and when he couldn't have her as his mistress, he had ensured she would be provided for anyway. It was an extraordinary outcome for a woman in Restoration England. The current Ranger's house was built between 1722 and 1724, 20 years after Frances's death. It replaced the earlier lodge she had lived in. The builder was Admiral Francis Hosier, who had purchased the leasehold of the position of Ranger of Greenwich Park. The architect was probably a member of the Office of Works, though no definitive attribution exists. The style is pure early Georgian, restrained, elegant, perfectly proportioned. This was the era when English architecture was moving away from the heavy Baroque of Christopher Wren toward the lighter, more classical style inspired by the Italian architect Andrea Palladio. The house is built of red brick with stone dressings, 2 stories with a semi-basement, 11 bays across the main facade. The central 3 bays project slightly forward and are topped with a pediment, creating a gentle emphasis without ostentation. The proportions are perfect. The window sizes decrease slightly as you go up the building, creating an illusion of greater height. The spacing between windows is mathematically precise. Everything is balanced, symmetrical, harmonious. This isn't a palace trying to impress you with its grandeur. It's a gentleman's villa demonstrating its sophistication through restraint and perfect proportion. The main entrance, on the south facade, opens into a central hall. In the Georgian period, the hall was the most public space of the house, where visitors would be received, where the family would gather. The Ranger's house hall was designed to impress but not overwhelm. Modestly sized, it featured simple classical moldings and a graceful staircase rising to the upper floor. The staircase is worth noting. It curves gently upward, with a turned balustrade and carved tread ends. Not as elaborate as the grand staircases in great country houses, but more sophisticated than a simple utilitarian stair. It announces that this is a house of taste and refinement. The principal rooms are on the ground floor and first floor. Drawing rooms, dining rooms, bedchambers, arranged in the traditional Georgian manner with formal entertaining spaces on the ground floor and more private family quarters above. The ceilings throughout are ornamented with simple plasterwork, egg and dart moldings, classical cornices, ceiling roses, nothing excessive, but everything correct. This was the Georgian ideal. Classical architecture applied with mathematical precision and restraint. The windows are tall sashes, another Georgian innovation. Large panes of glass were expensive in the early 18th century, so sash windows with big panes announced wealth and modernity. The Ranger's house windows are perfectly proportioned, allowing maximum light while maintaining the facade's symmetry. Behind the main house, there were service buildings. Kitchens, always separate from the main house to reduce fire risk and keep cooking smells out of the formal rooms. Stables, storage buildings. These have been modified over the centuries, but the basic layout remains. The grounds were more extensive in the 18th century. The house stood on the western edge of Greenwich Park, with formal gardens immediately surrounding it and the park's wilderness beyond. The Ranger's position gave the house's occupant control over these grounds, the right to maintain gardens, plant trees, and manage the park's landscape. From the upper windows, you could see across Greenwich Park to the Queen's House and the Royal Naval Hospital beyond. On a clear day, the view stretched to the Thames and the City of London in the distance. After Admiral Hosier built the new Ranger's House, the position and residence passed through a succession of distinguished occupants. In 1748, Philip Stanhope, 4th Earl of Chesterfield, became Ranger. Chesterfield was one of the most cultured men of his era, a statesman, diplomat, and writer. He's best known today for his Letters to His Son, a collection of correspondence offering advice on manners, education, and social success. They're still read as masterpieces of 18th century prose. Chesterfield transformed the Ranger's house. He added the gallery wing on the northeast side, around 1750. This long, top-lit gallery was designed to display his art collection, paintings, sculptures, and classical antiquities he had collected during his diplomatic service on the continent. The gallery is significant architecturally. It's one of the earliest purpose-built private art galleries in England. Before this period, aristocratic art collections were typically displayed throughout a house's living spaces. The idea of a dedicated gallery, a space designed solely for viewing and appreciating art, was innovative. Chesterfield's gallery stretched 70 feet long, with windows on one side and a coved ceiling. The light was carefully controlled to illuminate the paintings without causing glare. Sculptures were placed on pedestals along the walls, classical busts on brackets. It would have been a stunning space, quiet, contemplative, dedicated to aesthetic appreciation. Chesterfield lived at Ranger's House until his death in 1773. He was 80 years old. He had served as ambassador to The Hague, as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and as Secretary of State. He had written his famous letters, collected his art, and lived the life of an 18th-century gentleman scholar. After Chesterfield's death, the rangership passed to his nephew, who held it briefly before it went to another branch of the Stanhope family. For the next several decades, various members of the aristocracy held the position, treating the house as a pleasant country retreat on the edge of London. The 19th century brought changes. In 1807, the rangership passed to Princess Sophia Matilda of Gloucester, a niece of King George III. She was the first female ranger since Frances Stewart over a century earlier. Princess Sophia Matilda was an interesting figure, intelligent, artistic, and considerably more independent-minded than most royal women of her era. She held the position until her death in 1844. After her tenure, the house began to lose its prestige. The position of ranger became less important as Greenwich Park's management was formalized under government control. The house was still occupied by successive rangers, but it was no longer the sought-after appointment it had been in the 18th century. In 1902, the government purchased the house and its immediate grounds from the Crown. The days of the ranger as a significant position were over. The house needed a new purpose. It became the official residence of the park superintendent of Greenwich Park. Then, in 1914, it was converted to house the London Museum's collection of musical instruments and other artifacts. But World War I interrupted these plans, and the house was briefly used for military purposes. The early 20th century was not kind to Ranger's House. It was requisitioned during both World Wars. Parts of it fell into disrepair. The once elegant rooms were subdivided and modified for utilitarian purposes. The grounds were reduced as portions were sold off for development. By the 1950s, Ranger's House was in serious trouble. Post-war Britain was broke. Historic buildings across the country were being demolished because their owners couldn't afford upkeep. Ranger's House, with no clear function and mounting maintenance costs, seemed destined for demolition or conversion to apartments. What saved Ranger's House was the growing historic preservation movement. In the aftermath of World War II, Britain had lost so many historic buildings to bombing and demolition that people began to realize something irreplaceable was disappearing. The house was Grade 1 listed, the highest level of historic protection, which made demolition difficult. But listing doesn't pay for repairs. The building continued to deteriorate. In 1960, the government transferred the house to English Heritage's predecessor organization. They began the long process of restoration. The Victorian and 20th century alterations were carefully removed. Original Georgian features were restored or reconstructed based on documentary evidence. The house was returned, as closely as possible, to its early 18th century appearance. This kind of restoration is more complex than it might seem. You're not just repairing damaged plasterwork or replacing rotten timbers. You're making thousands of small decisions about what's original, what's later addition, what should be kept, and what should be removed. Should you keep the Victorian servants' bells even though they weren't part of the Georgian house? Should you restore the rooms to their 1720s appearance, or their 1750s appearance after Chesterfield's modifications? How do you balance historical accuracy with the practical needs of a public museum? The restoration took decades. Various phases addressed different parts of the building. The roof was completely reconstructed. The exterior brickwork was carefully repointed. Interior plasterwork was restored by craftsmen using traditional techniques. The Chesterfield Gallery, which had been heavily modified, was returned to something approaching its 18th century appearance. By the 1980s, Ranger's House was stable and presentable. but it still needed a purpose, a reason for the public to visit, and a collection to display in its elegant rooms. In 2002, exactly 300 years after Frances Stuart's death, Ranger's House found its perfect match, the Wernher collection. Sir Julius Wernher was a German-born British industrialist who made his fortune in South African diamond and gold mining in the late 19th century. He was phenomenally wealthy, one of the richest men in England by the time of his death in 1912. Wernher collected art obsessively: paintings, furniture, porcelain, jewelry, sculpture, anything beautiful and rare. He bought Renaissance paintings and medieval manuscripts. He acquired Limoges enamels and Sèvres porcelain. He collected so extensively that his London house could barely contain it all. After his death, the collection passed to his descendants, who eventually lent it to English Heritage for display at Ranger's House. It was an ideal match. The Georgian house provided an elegant domestic setting, much more appropriate than a large museum, and the Wernher collection gave Ranger's House the purpose it had lacked. Today, you can visit Ranger's House and see Julius Wernher's treasures displayed in the very rooms where Lord Chesterfield once entertained the intellectual elite of Georgian England. You walk through the entrance hall and up the restored staircase. The drawing rooms are filled with Renaissance paintings, portraits by Hans Memling, religious works by Filippino Lippi, Northern European masters from the 15th and 16th centuries. The paintings hang in the close-hung manner of the 18th century, frame touching frame, covering entire walls. In other rooms, you find displays of jewelry. Wernher collected extensively: Renaissance pendants, Baroque pearls, diamond tiaras from the 19th century. Each piece is exquisite, and together they form one of the finest private jewelry collections ever assembled. The porcelain collection fills several cabinets. Sèvres from the 18th century, with its distinctive royal blue and gilt decoration. Meissen from Germany, featuring delicate figurines and elaborate table services. Chelsea and Derby from England. Medieval and Renaissance objects occupy other spaces. Limoges enamels from 13th century France, their colours still brilliant after 700 years. Carved ivory panels, bronze sculptures, illuminated manuscript pages. I think what makes the Wernher collection so compelling in this setting is the contrast between the restraint of the Georgian architecture and the opulence of the objects. The house's simple elegance provides the perfect backdrop, allowing each object to shine without competition. Ranger's House sits at the southwestern corner of Greenwich Park, accessible from Crooms Hill or through the park itself. The red brick facade, perfectly preserved, looks much as it did in 1724. The formal gardens have been restored, not to any single historical period, but in a manner sympathetic to the house's Georgian character. Greenwich Park surrounds it, 180 acres of landscaped grounds, ancient trees, and spectacular views. The park itself is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, part of the Maritime Greenwich complex that includes the old Royal Naval College, the Queen's House, and the Royal Observatory. From Ranger's House, you can walk through the park to see the prime meridian at the observatory, the line of zero longitude that divides the eastern and western hemispheres. You can stand on the spot where, in 1884, the world's nations agreed to set their clocks by Greenwich Mean Time, or you can simply enjoy the park. Londoners have done so for centuries. It was enclosed as a royal hunting ground in 1433, during the reign of Henry VI. Henry VIII was born at Greenwich Palace, just north of the park. Elizabeth I walked here. Charles II, Frances Stuart's pursuer, commissioned the great avenue of Spanish chestnuts that still stands. The view from the high ground near the observatory is one of London's finest. The Thames curves through the city below. Canary Wharf's towers rise in the distance. The O2 Arena, built for the Millennium celebrations, sits on the river's north bank like a vast white tent. This is the view Frances Stuart would have known, though without the modern additions. She would have seen the Queen's House, designed by Inigo Jones for Charles I's Queen, Henrietta Maria. she would have seen the beginnings of what would become the Royal Naval Hospital, designed by Christopher Wren, John Vanbrugh, and Nicholas Hawksmoor, three of England's greatest architects working in succession on a single magnificent complex. From her house on the park's western edge, Frances would have watched the seasons change. Spring, when the ancient chestnut trees bloom. Summer, when Londoners escape the city's heat to walk in the shade. Autumn, when the leaves turn gold and russet. Winter, when frost covers the grass and deer shelter in the wooded areas. She was the ranger. The park was her responsibility and her domain. I've thought a lot about what Frances Stuart's story really means. On one level, it's a simple tale of a beautiful woman who refused a king and survived. But I think it's more complex than that. Frances understood power in a way most people at court didn't. She recognized that saying yes to Charles would give her immediate benefits, wealth, apartments, influence, but would ultimately leave her vulnerable. The moment Charles tired of her, she would be discarded. Look at what happened to Barbara Villiers. She remained influential for years, but eventually Charles moved on to other mistresses, and Barbara's power waned. By the end of Charles's reign, she was still wealthy, but no longer relevant. Frances chose a different path. By maintaining her virtue, she remained valuable. She could marry respectably. And more importantly, she retained Charles's genuine affection in a way his actual mistresses never could. Because he never possessed her, he never grew tired of her. There's something deeply strategic about this. Frances wasn't just protecting her virtue for moral reasons, though she may well have been moral. She was also ensuring her long-term security in a world where women's security was always precarious. And Charles, to his credit, recognized and respected this. He could have destroyed her when she eloped with Richmond. Instead, he eventually welcomed her back, continued to favor her, and ensured she had income and position for life. This suggests something important about Charles II that gets lost in the caricature of the merry monarch who just wanted to sleep with as many women as possible. Charles was capable of genuine affection. He could appreciate a woman who wouldn't sleep with him. He could admire virtue even when it frustrated his desires. The position of Ranger of Greenwich Park that he gave Frances wasn't just a consolation prize. It was a statement. It said, "You matter, even though you refused me. You deserve respect and security. You are more than just a potential mistress." I find this surprisingly moving. In an era when women had so little power, when their sexuality was often their only currency, Frances found a way to maintain her independence. And Charles, despite being an absolute monarch who could have anything he wanted, learned to accept that some things couldn't be taken. They could only be given. Ranger's house stands as a monument to this unusual story. Not the house Frances actually lived in, that's long gone, but the house that succeeded it, built on the same site, inheriting the same position. The Georgian building we see today represents a different aesthetic than Frances's era. The Restoration Court loved excess, elaborate wigs, ornate clothing, heavy Baroque architecture. By the 1720s, taste had shifted. Georgian architecture prized restraint, proportion, mathematical perfection. Less decoration, more refinement. But both eras understood one thing. Architecture is a statement. A building announces who you are and what you value. Ranger's house announces taste, cultivation, and a certain quiet confidence. It doesn't shout. The facade is elegant but not ostentatious. The proportions are perfect but not showy. It's a house that says, "I don't need to impress you with grandeur because my sophistication speaks for itself." This seems appropriate for a house connected to Frances Stuart's memory. Frances didn't need to be ostentatious either. Her beauty spoke for itself. Her virtue was its own statement. She didn't need to compete with the king's other mistresses by being more sexually available or more dramatically visible. She won by being different, by being unavailable. The house, in its Georgian restraint, embodies a similar principle. It wins your admiration not through excess, but through perfect judgment and proportion. Rangers House exists in a remarkable context. Greenwich isn't just any London neighbourhood. It's a place where English history has layered itself, century after century, into a relatively small area. The old Royal Naval College, just north of Greenwich Park, was originally Greenwich Palace. Henry VII built it. Henry VIII was born there. Both of his daughters, Mary I and Elizabeth I, were born there. Elizabeth spent much of her childhood there. By Charles II's time, the old Tudor palace was decaying. Charles commissioned John Webb to design a new palace, but only one wing was built, the King Charles Block, which still stands as part of the Naval College complex. The rest of the medieval palace was eventually demolished. Then, in the 1690s, Queen Mary II decided the site should become a hospital for retired seamen, a naval equivalent of the Chelsea Hospital for soldiers. Christopher Wren designed it. Work continued under John Vanbrugh and Nicholas Hawksmoor after Wren's death. The result is one of England's most magnificent Baroque complexes, two massive colonnaded buildings facing each other across a courtyard, with the Queen's House perfectly framed in the gap between them. The Queen's House itself is an architectural jewel. Inigo Jones designed it in 1616 for Anne of Denmark, wife of James I. It was England's first consciously classical building, a pure Renaissance design that looked nothing like the Tudor and Jacobean architecture surrounding it. Jones had visited Italy and seen Palladian villas. He brought that aesthetic back to England. The Queen's House was revolutionary. Frances Stewart would have known all these buildings. When she looked out from her Ranger's Lodge, she was looking at the accumulated architectural heritage of English monarchy, from the Tudors through the Stuarts to her own time. And today, from Ranger's House, you can still see this layering of history. The Queen's House, pure Renaissance. The Naval College, triumphant Baroque. The 19th century maritime buildings. The modern city beyond. Greenwich preserves its history better than almost anywhere in London. The park has been protected since the 15th century. The major buildings are all listed and maintained. It's a place where you can still see what Frances Stuart saw, walk where she walked, understand the world she inhabited. Here's something I think about. Frances Stuart has been largely forgotten. Most people who visit Ranger's House today have never heard of her. They come to see the Wernher collection, not to remember the woman who refused a king. There's no statue of Frances in Greenwich Park, no plaque marking her connection to the house. Her grave, in Westminster Abbey, a mark of her status, is not particularly prominent. She's not part of the usual narratives we tell about Restoration England. We remember Charles II. We remember his mistresses, Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille. These women who gave the king what he wanted are remembered, celebrated even, as colourful characters in a colourful era. Frances, who refused, is forgotten. I think this is revealing. History often remembers the scandalous more than the virtuous. Nell Gwynn, the actress who became the king's mistress, is a beloved figure, the cheeky working-class girl who captivated a king. Barbara Villiers is remembered as a dramatic, powerful figure who dominated Charles for years. Both have biographies, historical novels, even films made about them. Frances gets footnotes. But perhaps there's a different kind of victory in this. The mistresses are remembered because they were mistresses, because their relationship with the king was sexual and therefore interesting. Frances is remembered when she's remembered at all for her refusal, for being the one who said no. Her face is on British coins, or was for centuries. Every penny and halfpenny minted in Britain from the 1670s through the 19th century carried her image as Britannia. Millions of people handled her face without knowing who she was. That's a strange kind of immortality, to be seen by everyone and known by almost no one. Ranger's House, though not among England's most famous buildings, represents something important in architectural history. It's part of the movement toward Georgian restraint and classical proportion that would dominate English architecture for most of the 18th century. The early 1720s, when the house was built, were a transitional period. The Baroque of Rennes, Vanbrugh, and Hawksmoor was giving way to the Palladian revival championed by Lord Burlington and Colin Campbell. English architecture was turning away from continental Baroque toward a purified classicism based on ancient Roman architecture and the 16th century Italian architect Andrea Palladio. Ranger's House isn't a pure Palladian villa, it's too modest, too English, too practical. But it shows the influence, the symmetry, the proportions, the restraint of decoration. These are Palladian principles applied to a relatively modest country house. Over the following decades, this became the standard English approach. From grand country houses to modest urban townhouses, Georgian architecture followed these principles: symmetry, proportion, classical detail used sparingly. The result was an architectural style of remarkable consistency and quality. You can see Georgian buildings all over Britain that look like cousins of Ranger's House. 2 stories, red brick, sash windows, a modestly emphasized central entrance. From Bath's Royal Crescent to Edinburgh's New Town to countless country houses and urban terraces, the Georgian style created a visual unity across Britain. Ranger's House is part of this tradition, not famous enough to have influenced it directly, but representative of the values that made it successful. Julius Wernher's story deserves attention because it explains how Ranger's House found its current purpose. Wernher was born in Darmstadt, Germany, in 1850. He arrived in South Africa in 1871, just as the diamond rush was beginning. He worked for a company in Kimberley, learned the diamond business, and eventually partnered with Alfred Beit to create one of the largest mining operations in South Africa. They made astronomical sums. By the 1890s, Wernher was one of the richest men in the world. He moved to London, became a British subject, and was made a baronet in 1905. With his wealth, he collected art. Not as an investment, though the pieces certainly appreciated, but out of genuine love for beautiful objects. He built Bath House in London's Piccadilly, an enormous mansion, to house his collections. The house was built around the art, with rooms designed specifically to display paintings, sculpture, porcelain, and jewellery. After his death in 1912, the collection passed to his son, Sir Harold Wernher, who added to it. Sir Harold married Anastasia de Torby, daughter of Grand Duke Michael Mikhailovich of Russia and granddaughter of Tsar Nicholas I. Anastasia, known as Zia, brought Russian imperial jewellery and art into the collection. When Sir Harold died in 1973, the collection faced an uncertain future. Death duties were crushing. Bath House had already been demolished in 1960. The land was too valuable, the house too expensive to maintain. The collection was in danger of being dispersed through auction. Sir Harold's widow and children worked with English Heritage to find a solution. The collection would be lent to English Heritage and displayed at Ranger's House. This arrangement preserved it intact while giving the public access. The collection arrived at Ranger's House in stages through the 1980s and 1990s. It officially opened to the public in 2002. For the first time in decades, Ranger's House had a clear purpose and a collection worthy of its elegant rooms. You approach Ranger's House from Crooms Hill, the road that runs along Greenwich Park's western edge. The house sits back from the road, approached through a modest gate and short drive. The red brick facade faces south, catching the afternoon sun. English Heritage manages the property. You buy your ticket and enter through the semi-basement level, where there's a small shop and information area. Then you go up to the main entrance hall. The experience is deliberately domestic in scale. This isn't the British Museum or the National Gallery, where you're overwhelmed by the size and quantity. Ranger's House offers something different, an intimate encounter with extraordinary objects in a setting that helps you understand how they were originally meant to be seen. The rooms are elegantly furnished with period pieces, not exact reconstructions of how the rooms looked in the 18th century, We don't know enough detail for that, but evocations of the period. The walls are painted in colours typical of Georgian interiors: soft greens, dusty pinks, stone colours. The windows have simple curtains. The floors are polished wood. In each room, Wernher's treasures are displayed in cases or hung on walls. The paintings are in heavy gilt frames, Renaissance and Baroque frames, many original to the paintings. The jewellery is in glass cases with careful lighting. The porcelain is arranged on shelves. You move through the rooms in a circuit, each space revealing new aspects of the collection. A room of paintings leads to a room of jewellery, leads to a room of porcelain and furniture. The Chesterfield Gallery, at the end of the circuit, provides a dramatic conclusion. The long skylit space filled with major paintings and sculptures. The scale is perfect. You can spend 2 hours here and see everything properly. You're never rushing. You can stop and really look at a painting, examine the craftsmanship of a piece of jewellery, appreciate the delicacy of porcelain decoration. I think this is what historic houses do best. They give you a human-scale experience of history and art. Ranger's House succeeds because it doesn't try to compete with larger museums. It offers something different: intimacy, domesticity, the sense that you're visiting someone's home rather than an institution. After visiting Ranger's House, the logical next step is to explore Greenwich Park itself. The park has several distinct areas, each with its own character. The formal areas near the Queen's House and Naval College feature geometric paths, planted beds, and manicured lawns. This is where Londoners come to sit in the sun, have picnics, watch their children play. Further south, the park becomes more naturalistic. Ancient trees, oaks, chestnuts, hawthorns, create shaded groves. The deer park, established in the 15th century, still maintains a herd of fallow and red deer. They're not wild, they're managed by the park authorities, but seeing deer in the middle of London is still remarkable. At the park's highest point stands the Royal Observatory. Flamsteed House, designed by Christopher Wren in 1675, was the first purpose-built scientific research facility in Britain. Here, the astronomers royal mapped the stars, improved navigation, and eventually established the Greenwich meridian as the world's prime meridian, the line of zero longitude. You can stand with 1 foot in the eastern hemisphere and 1 foot in the western hemisphere. A brass line marks the exact spot. It's become one of London's most popular photo opportunities. From this high ground, the view is spectacular. The formal symmetry of the Naval College and Queen's House, the Thames beyond, the towers of Canary Wharf and the City of London. On clear days you can see 10 miles or more. This is the view that made Greenwich a royal favourite for centuries. The palace commanded the heights overlooking the river, the main highway into London. You could see threats approaching. You had clear air away from the city's pollution. You had space for hunting in the park. Frances Stewart knew this landscape intimately. As ranger, she walked these paths, managed these woods, oversaw the deer. The park was her domain in a way most people never experience. Not just a place to visit, but a place she was responsible for maintaining and protecting. One aspect of Ranger's House and the rangership that's easy to overlook is the economics. How did these positions work? How did people afford to maintain these houses? The position of ranger came with a salary. Not enormous, but substantial. It also came with housing, obviously. But more importantly, it came with perquisites, the right to sell excess timber from the park, the right to charge fees for various park uses, the right to keep any fines collected for violations of park rules. These perquisites could add up. A clever ranger could make the position quite lucrative. There were also less official benefits: influence, patronage, the ability to grant favours to powerful people who might return those favours. For aristocrats like Lord Chesterfield, the rangership was less about income than about prestige and convenience. He had substantial wealth from his estates and political positions. Ranger's house was attractive because it gave him an elegant residence on the edge of London, where he could entertain, display his art collection, and maintain the kind of intellectual salon he enjoyed. For someone like Frances Stewart, the economics were different. She had no family estates to fall back on. Her income came entirely from royal favour. The pensions Charles II left her, the positions he gave her. The rangership provided housing and income that made her financially independent. She didn't need to remarry or depend on relatives for support. This financial independence was rare for women in her era. Most widows were dependent on their children or their late husband's family. Frances had her own income and her own house. She answered to no one. I think this is another dimension of her victory over circumstances. She had started with nothing but beauty and virtue. She had used those assets carefully, refusing to trade them cheaply. And she ended with genuine independence, financial security, social position, and the respect of English society. Why does Ranger's house survive when so many similar houses have been lost? It's worth examining because the survival of historic buildings is never inevitable. First, location helped. Sitting on the edge of Greenwich Park, the house was protected from development by the park itself. You couldn't tear down Ranger's house and build apartment blocks because the park prevented that kind of urban development. Second, the building's association with the park gave it official protection. It wasn't just a private residence that an owner could demolish if they chose. It had always been tied to a public function. Third, the house benefited from changing attitudes toward historic preservation. By the mid-20th century, when many similar buildings were being demolished, public opinion had shifted. People valued historic buildings more. Listing provided legal protection. Organizations like English Heritage took responsibility for buildings at risk. But survival requires more than legal protection. Buildings need purposes. They need reasons for people to visit, maintain, and care about them. This is where the Wernher collection proved crucial. Without it, Ranger's house might have survived as a protected building, but remained closed to the public, gradually deteriorating despite its listed status. The collection gave the house life. It attracted visitors. It justified the cost of maintenance and restoration. It made Ranger's house relevant to contemporary London rather than just a historic relic. This is the challenge facing historic buildings everywhere. Protection and funding aren't enough. Buildings need active uses that make them valuable to contemporary society while respecting their historic character. Frances Stuart lived until 1702, dying at age 55. The last decades of her life were quiet and respectable. She never remarried after Richmond's death. She maintained her position as Ranger of Greenwich Park. She received her pensions from Charles II's estate. She wasn't forgotten. She still attended court occasionally. She maintained friendships with other members of the aristocracy. But she was no longer the stunning beauty who had captivated Charles II. She was a respectable widow, living comfortably in semi-retirement. We don't have extensive records of these later years. No diaries, few letters. She appears occasionally in other people's correspondence, mentioned in passing, but not as a central figure. The woman who had been the subject of intense gossip and attention for years had become just another aristocratic widow. There's a portrait of Frances from around 1690, when she was in her 40s. She's still beautiful. Her features remain fine and delicate. But there's a maturity and sadness in her expression. This isn't the radiant girl who had arrived at court 3 decades earlier. This is a woman who has experienced both triumph and loss, who has outlived the king who loved her and the husband she married. She died at her house in London in October 1702. The exact cause is unknown, probably one of the illnesses that killed so many people in that era before modern medicine. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the Henry VII Lady Chapel, one of the Abbey's most prestigious locations. Her tomb is modest, but positioned among monuments to royalty and the highest nobility. The choice of burial location is significant. Westminster Abbey was reserved for people of importance, royalty, great nobles, national heroes. Frances's burial there confirms her status. She wasn't just a former beauty or a rejected royal mistress. She was a woman of standing who deserved to be honoured among England's great. I've been thinking about what it means that Ranger's house survives while the actual house Frances lived in is gone. There's something metaphorically appropriate about this. Frances herself is largely forgotten. But the position she held, Ranger of Greenwich Park, continues. The house associated with that position continues. The park she managed continues. The legacy is institutional rather than personal. Perhaps this is fitting. Frances's significance wasn't really personal. It was about what she represented. She represented the possibility of female agency in a world that offered women very little. She represented virtue in a notably dissolute court. She represented the idea that refusal could be as powerful as acceptance. These are abstract ideas, not tied to a specific building. So it's appropriate that no specific physical space preserves her memory. Instead, the institution survives: the park, the house, the position of Ranger. The current Ranger's house, built 20 years after her death, inherits her legacy without being literally the same space. It occupies the same ground, serves the same function, exists in the same relationship to the park. The physical structure changed, but the meaning persisted. This is how institutions work. They outlast individuals. The Rangers who came after Frances had their own stories, their own relationships with the house and park. Lord Chesterfield's occupancy is probably more architecturally significant than Frances's. His gallery wing still stands, after all. But Frances's story gives the institution its emotional resonance. Standing in Ranger's house today, you're in a building from 1724, restored in the late 20th century, displaying a collection assembled in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, connected to a woman who lived in the late 17th century. 4 centuries of history layered together. This is what historic buildings do. They compress time. They make different eras coexist in the same physical space. The Georgian architecture houses Victorian and Edwardian collecting tastes, while evoking the memory of a Restoration courtesan who refused to be kept. None of these layers is authentic, in the sense of being purely of its moment. The building has been modified, restored, adapted. The collection wasn't assembled for this space. The connection to Teresa Stuart is commemorative rather than direct. But authenticity might not be the point. Perhaps what matters is continuity, the sense that this place has meant something for centuries, has been valued and preserved, has accumulated significance through the devotion of multiple generations. Ranger's house today is a palimpsest, a surface where multiple texts have been written, partly erased, and rewritten. You can see traces of all the layers if you look carefully: the Georgian bones, the Chesterfield additions, the Victorian modifications, the 20th century restorations, the 21st century museum installations. Each era has left its mark, and remarkably, these marks don't cancel each other out. They coexist, creating a richer and more complex whole than any single era could have produced. So what should we make of Ranger's house and its connection to Teresa Stuart? I think the story teaches us several things. First, about the complexity of power and resistance. Frances's refusal of Charles II looks like a simple moral choice: virtue over vice. But it was also a strategic choice about long-term security over short-term gain. She understood that her value to Charles would last longer if she remained unattainable. And she was right. Second, about the durability of institutions versus individuals. Frances is largely forgotten, but the position she held survives. The park she managed is one of London's treasures. The house associated with her office remains elegant and cared for. Individual humans fade, but the structures they inhabited can persist for centuries. Third, about the evolution of buildings and their meanings. Ranger's house has been many things: a ranger's lodge, a nobleman's villa, an art gallery, a military headquarters, a museum. Its meaning has shifted with each transformation. But somehow it retains coherence, remains recognizably itself through all these changes. Fourth, about the importance of preservation and adaptive reuse. Without the Wernher collection, Ranger's house would probably still exist, protected by its listed status, but it would be a shell, maybe used for offices or storage. The collection gives it life, makes it relevant, ensures it's maintained and visited. Finally, about the strange ways history remembers us. Frances Stuart's face was on British coins for over 200 years, seen by billions of people. But she's not famous. Most people who visit Ranger's house don't know about her. She achieved a kind of anonymous immortality, present but unrecognized. There's something poignant about that. She won her battles in life. She maintained her virtue, married respectably, lived comfortably, died honored. But she lost the battle for memory. The mistresses who gave Charles what he wanted are remembered and celebrated. Frances, who refused, is a footnote. Or perhaps that's not quite right. Perhaps she won a different kind of immortality. Not fame, but influence. The idea that a woman could refuse a king and prosper, that became part of English cultural memory, even if Frances's name didn't attach to it. She proved it was possible. That mattered. And Ranger's house stands as an inadvertent monument to that possibility. A graceful Georgian villa on the edge of Greenwich Park, filled with Renaissance paintings and imperial jewelry, welcoming visitors who come to see beauty and craftsmanship. They might not know Frances Stuart's name, but they're walking in spaces shaped by the legacy of her choices. The house endures, the park endures, the memory of a woman who said no to a king. That endures too, even if the details have faded. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival itself, in whatever form, is victory.